Welcome back to another episode of our Raising the Brand series here at Private Equity Marketeer. I'm Matt Curtolo, your host and advisory council member here at Private Equity Marketeer. Raising the Brand is all about highlighting the creative minds and strategic thinkers who are defining how private markets connect with their audiences, build trust, and tell their stories. Today's going to be a great one. We're joined by Henry Yan, the principal and head of capital solutions at Whistler Capital Partners, where he oversees capital formation and partnerships. Henry's career spans the full spectrum of capital formation, from advisory roles at Campbell and Probitas Partners to co-leading investor relations and co-investments at CBC Group, Asia's largest healthcare dedicated private equity firm. So Henry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Matt, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So we'll dive right in. You have worked across nearly every facet of capital formation, from placement agents to in-house, now leading capital solutions at Whistler. I know it's rarely a straight line in terms of career path, but maybe you can tell us what drew you to this side of the industry and give you a little bit of background on how you got here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt. And happy to give a brief intro on my background. I mean, exactly to your point, I think few folks graduating from college think to themselves, I'm going to do IR. Right? I'm going to head into fundraising right after. So my path was certainly not a straightforward one. Was a history major in college, graduated, embarking on the pre-law track, opted to go work at a large New York City law firm as a paralegal instead of going straight to law school. Thank goodness. Ended up at the law firm, worked for almost 2 years, and then realized quite quickly that I did not want to pursue law. Then, quite serendipitously, a recruiter reached out saying, hey, look, I represent this quite lean PE fund. They're looking for help on both the compliance and IR/fundraising side. At the time, of course, I had no idea what fundraising was, but thought it's not law. So joined the firm. The firm is called MHR Fund Management. Had great experience there. And they had engaged the UBS Private Funds Group. And so as soon as I joined for, first week, the role pivoted from a hybrid role split between compliance and fundraising into pure fundraising and pure IR. Stayed for the duration of that fundraise. By the end of it, clocked the fact that, oh, look, single strategy fund pre-COVID, there is going to be, relatively speaking, downtime. But I thought to myself, as a 25-year-old in Manhattan, probably makes more sense to be learning, getting more reps, getting more churn. And so look to the fundraising placement side. So your independent boutiques like your Probitas, Campbell, Reed, Asante, but also some of the larger banks. So Evercore, Lazard, et cetera. I thought that was a really great way to get some initial sort of exposure, cut my teeth, and really learn what fundraising 101 was like. Mm-hmm. So joined and never looked back.
Excellent. Maybe draw that a little bit forward, because I think there's more in your background in terms of the diversity of the roles that you then had. So kind of going from, I have a great deal of respect, having sat on the LP side for 20 plus years, of the placement agent community and the way that they value relationships, but you have worked in-house and obviously your role now. Maybe you can just outline how those different vantage points shaped the way you think about investor relationships.
Absolutely. I mean, I think just back to basics, I started out on the project management side. So in the world of placement agents, as you know, Matt, it's split between distribution and LP coverage and sort of product specialists and project managers, those folks that are working on everything and anything not related to direct LP coverage. So when I was at Probitas, when I was in-house at MHR, when I was at Campbell, I was primarily on the project management side. But I think that really gave me a very solid grounding and foundation for what fundraising is, how to run a fundraise, how to be client-facing, how to strategize, and just be thoughtful generally, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you're living in the world of next steps, right? After every meeting, after every call, what's the next step, right? And I noticed sitting in my seat at these placement agents that some of the best relationship managers and some of the best sales folks were previously project managers, right? They automatically understood the product, could dive quite deep, but also be able to position that clearly to LPs, obviously manage those relationships, back channel for feedback, all of that good stuff. So I think to answer your question, it was really helpful to start my career on the placement agent side, get that sort of initial training, and then apply it in-house. So I then, as you had mentioned, joined a private equity firm out in Asia called CBC Group, where I was covering mostly rest of the world. So think Europe, Middle East, and Asia. So a multiplicity of different cultures, different habits, different mannerisms. It was an amazing experience to just be able to cover LPs in that part of the world, but apply what I had learned in New York, right? And then I came back from Asia essentially right after COVID in 22, joined my current firm here now, Whistler. And so kind of now applying that on a sort of global basis. So not only do we look at rest of world, but as you can imagine, Matt, given it's a first-time fund in the US, most of our LP base is going to be US and a little bit of Western Europe as well, of course.
Sure. And my guess would be that spans the entire range of LPs today, from high net worth, family office, right? We think about retail, we think about institutional, and then you divide each of those up into baskets. It's good to have all those skill sets that you've had along the way to be able to, again, you're always learning about, as this asset class always evolves, but having that experience both in the US and globally at different size firms has to position you in a really good place.
Absolutely. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. It's the reps, right? I mean, Matt, as you've come to see with various placement or in-house folks, the experience matters, right? Because as everyone knows, no two fundraisers are the same, but they do rhyme, right? You're going to see something that's similar. You're going to see something that you think, okay, for this infra fundraise, this is what happened. This is how we resolved it. But we can do better, right? I'm going to apply that this time, but tweak it just a little bit. I've seen that again and again and again. That's part of the reason why I love this business, is because you can obviously leverage what you've learned and hopefully make it better and apply it better.
Definitely. Well, I want to use that as a pivot point. You've used the term fundraise and investor relations. Your title now is head of capital solutions. So I think the evolution of what the role actually encompasses and what it means has evolved with the market. So maybe you could spend a little time on what does capital solutions mean for your role at Whistler in practice with both investors and other stakeholders?
It's a great question. I mean, to me, capital solutions and capital formation, as is also often called, is really being the bridge between LPs, between your team in-house. And even though I am on Team Whistler, I am very much the LP's best advocate internally. I mean, in terms of best practices, norms, expectations, feedback. This is all, these are all components of what I deliver to our team real time, right? Every Monday morning, I sit down and I say, hey, look, I've had these catch ups. This is, this is X, Y, and Z that I learned from our LPs or our prospective LPs. This is how we should learn from this, apply it. So I think first and foremost, you're being a bridge, right? And I do think when it comes time for fundraising, a big element of my role is connecting the right people to the right people. And so I'm sure everyone would agree with this, but you represent a product better when you believe in it, right? And so that's been the case when I was at CPC. That's very much been the case when I'm here at Whistler. Is I believe in my guys, always happy to go to bat for them. I believe that what they're doing is truly differentiated, impactful, and I'm trying to figure out new ways to highlight that every day, right? To the LPs. And of course, not just Whistler, the platform, but just us as a sounding board and as a sort of advisor for the healthcare markets, right? Because as we know, super nuanced, plenty of wrinkles. LPs always have questions about, what's next? What are the headwinds? What are the tailwinds? It's very much my role to make sure their voices are heard. So that's first and foremost what I view to be important. Second is obviously, beyond servicing our existing LPs, is running a smooth and seamless fundraise. My 2 cents is that every LP who sees my name in their inbox should think, oh, I like Henry. He's super helpful to me whenever I need anything, market mapping, et cetera. He's always there. I'm very happy to catch up with him. If he's in town for a coffee, would love to, right? And internally, I also want folks to think, for example, our finance team, to see my email come through and think, oh, I like Henry. I'm happy to work through these DD requests or LP requests. I'm not going to punt this to the end of my inbox, right? And so I think again, it's it's a fascinating role and a fascinating job because it's not the most technical, but you absolutely have to be user friendly, have relatively good EQ, and just help everyone do their jobs better, right?
Sure.
At the end of the day.
Well, You said two things that I want to kind of dive in a little bit deeper. I almost said double click, but that's one of those finance phrases I'm rid of. Uh, but the idea of capital formation. We had a conversation in our Always Be fundraising series about the delicacy of this role, right? You are LPs advocates, but you ultimately represent your firm. So how do I guess you just said it with EQ, but how do you know sort of when to push on LP's behalf, knowing that it could cause some internal strife versus have to hold the line very strongly and maybe ruffle some feathers among the LP community?
So that's a great question. I mean, I think I would tie this back to the team point and the underwriting or GP point. I can confidently say that at both CBC Group, my prior firm, as well as Whistler, LPs come first. There was never a situation where, for example, when I was sitting in Shanghai, which is obviously 12-hour time difference for most of the year, I would turn to my then CEO and say, hey, look, Fue, we've got this investor call Thursday night at 9 p.m. He would always say, I'm there for it. He would never brush it off. He would never say, oh, why don't you take it? He would always be very focused on maintaining that existing relationship or prospective relationship and focusing on that as a priority. Same thing at Whistler. I think across the board, most, if not all, the market feedback points that I've taken to the team, they've taken in good stride. And they've said, okay, that's good to know. We did spin out from, a large insurance corporate. Always happy to learn more, right? And do right by the LP.
Yeah, I think that you touch on something there. This mindset of always learning, right? I think that is something that you talked about, the evolution of the market, but even within your own firm, within your own strategy, dealing with people, right? This is a people business, right? I always say, as an LP, I'm investing in a blind pool. So even if there's a couple assets in there, I'm still investing in the long term. So the people matter most, and having that ability to, I loved your analogy of, you want people to have a positive view of interaction with you internally and externally. And that can make a big difference, right? As an LP, we're getting bombarded with emails and requests and things like that. If we've developed a relationship and you've been helpful from a professional perspective, I think that goes a long way. I was curious. I wanted to ask if there were certain things that tricks or tips that you could give to folks on, how to develop those relationships rather than what sometimes feels a lot more transactional in a fundraising process.
I think my approach has always been, treat LPs as you would want to be treated.
Mhm.
Right. I always look at, exactly to your point. I mean, every day, I'm sure there's hundreds of emails that come through the transom, and they're having to sift through all of these different inbounds, cold emails, follow-ups, et cetera. And so whenever I finally do get time with an LP, I just try to treat them as human beings, right? Hear about the story, what they like, what they don't like. Just take a step back from, representing Whistler, at least in the first, second, or even third meetings, and just say, how can I help? Right? Let me know what your program is looking at. Let me know where your priorities are. What have you chatted about during your quarterly IC meetings? What are the pain points, right? I mean, let us know how we can bridge any sort of gaps for you.
Uh-huh.
Would love to hear about, again, their families, vacation plans. I think these are all very, very easy things to do, at least from my perspective.
Sure.
Because, I just love chatting with folks. I think don't overthink it. Just treat LPs as you would want to be treated. Be very sympathetic, right? Because I really don't think that every IR or capital formation person knows just how inundated LPs inboxes are. I mean, it's
Yeah.
wild. I'm sure.
It definitely is. And to your point, it goes a long way when we can have that conversation that doesn't just go right into the details about here are the numbers I need. Give me the update. What's the next step in the process? We joke about it, right? The average limited partnership agreement extends beyond most marriages here in the US. So it is a long-term commitment, and maybe the person changes, but your organizational contact, or you really want to be thought of as a respected counterparty and hopefully a friend at some point too. Henry, let's transition a little over to Whistler now. So you are a specialist in healthcare. It's one of those things that requires some education in the market. It's also one of those things where everyone has experience with healthcare in their daily lives. So How much is that a headwind or a tailwind in how you portray and describe what you do to the market?
Yeah, I think healthcare is a tricky one, right? I think healthcare is it's funny because, and perhaps this is too candid. I think you have to have a baseline assumption that the LP likes healthcare. If
Mhm.
they don't, or if it's not a big program priority, you're probably not going to convince them otherwise. And again, perhaps this is too candid, but I just think in the year 2025, you're going to be hard pressed to convince an LP that instead of X, Y, and Z sectors, they should focus on A, B, and C, right? However, that said, I think for folks who do understand that healthcare is 20% of our GDP and growing, the fact that it plays, a role in all of our lives in some capacity, who do acknowledge that it's complicated, nuanced, but do want to understand it, those are the folks that we are generally speaking looking to connect with. People who acknowledge that it's important, that it's a big facet of the economy. And then when we do get in front of them, I think it's really simplifying the story, right? Obviously laying out current state of play, what our proposal is, what our thesis is, what our, investment themes are. And I always tell my team, let's try to cut back on the acronyms, right? DVMs, CMS. Let's assume that acronyms just don't exist. And let's just tell the story, right? Not overcomplicate things because, I mean, as you can probably imagine, maybe a quarter to a third of the LPs that we chat with have a very, 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 plugged in, know everything about healthcare in the US. And the other, two thirds don't really track it that closely, right? I mean, and frankly speaking, that's why they're investing with a healthcare services manager, right? Because they want you to be the ears and eyes on the ground. And so I think my role has always been, guys, simplify it, right? Keep it straightforward, really highlight, what's wrong with the system, how we can improve it, why we are, best positioned to do so. And that's it, right?
Mm. And I guess the follow-up to that is you mentioned before, like being helpful, providing market maps, providing context around trends. When does that come into the conversation, right? You want to go into an open door, I always say, is like you want to know that the LP is interested. But even then, to your point, very few people have the depth. When do you start telling them about, they're interested, they like it, but when do you start explaining the nuances that really are going to make a strategy like yours shine?
I would say it depends on the pacing of their follow-up questions.
Okay.
I think this dovetails into, another important aspect of fundraising or even intro calls is let the LP speak, right? I mean, just take a step back, be like, let us know where you are in your program, and we're happy to tailor our pitch, our discussion, our conversation. I think too often folks lean immediately into the call, kind of go on for 30 minutes and then call it. And guess what? The LP is going to call it too, right? And so if you don't keep it interactive, if you don't keep it interesting, if you don't pay attention to the program, I think it's a difficult conversation, right? So hopefully this does respond to your query, but it depends on their reactions, what follow-up questions they ask.
Yeah, I mean that level of restraint really does show, right? You could talk, you and your partners could talk about the space, the companies, all of this at length, as much as invited to. But I think that's the critical piece. Is you said it's kind of a masterclass comment of just let the LP talk, right? Let me tell you what I'm interested in, and you can respond to that. You are the expert in the room, and you want the LP to be curious, but you never know if you're going down the wrong road if you start without asking. So I think it's a highly important but underestimated point about just letting that be a conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, just look to the LP for the guideposts, right? Most, if not all, will give you them, right? In the
Yeah.
very beginning of the conversation, they'll say, "This is where we are. Please,
Yeah,
dive deeper into this topic." Right?
absolutely. Well, and cadence too, right? Hopefully a first call leads to a second call, to a third call, to
Absolutely.
however many calls it takes to get to a commitment. So there is a little bit of that, as well as you don't need to tell everybody everything in that first call.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, Henry, this is the Raising the Brand series. So I do want to talk about, brand. A lot of firms talk about it, but few clearly define it. I would just love your explanation or how you characterize brand in the context of capital formation. And what do you think GPs can do to strengthen it over time?
It's a great question. I think for me, it really ties into thought leadership. I think, and again, this is just from my perspective, sitting at a healthcare services fund, there are many healthcare services funds, right? I think where you could be differentiated is in your strategy, is in your team. It's where you fit on that market map, but it's also how helpful you are, right? And helping LPs to distill such complicated information into digestible, whether it be quarterly letters, regular messaging, just reaching out to them and keeping them apprised, making them look good in front of their bosses, their
Sure.
committees, right? Going to them, yeah, it could be as simple as every quarter we distill the largest or the most important and notable healthcare regulatory updates, right? And then just shipping that off to the LP. I mean, listen, I think it sounds like low hanging fruit, but I would wager to say that many GPs still don't do this, right? I think,
Sure.
unfortunately, many GPs still take the view of if we build it, they will come.
Sure.
But I think in this ever evolving, kind of environment, macro, especially, people want to stay in the know, right? And it doesn't have to be anything super long or super extended. It doesn't have to be 3 to 5 to 10 pages. It can just be one page, right? For every quarter. And you ship it off and you say, hey, LPX, please read this on your subway ride, right?
Yeah.
I do think this will help inform you on what's happened. It's a quick spark notes of that you can take back again internally and say, well, gosh, Whistler or GPX of ours, we really like partnering with them because aside from showing us a lot of co-investment, they also really actually tell us what's going on in the healthcare market.
Sure.
I think that's important, right? And so I think branding in the one aspect just really refers to how you approach the market, how you distill that market for an LP.
Mhm.
I think the other bits of it, again, are just, I want LPs to, think about Whistler as being super responsive, being all over it, being super transparent. I want that to be the first impression whenever LPs think about us. And obviously, we all know LPs talk to one another, so that can only help, right? And we just
Yeah.
want to, again, show that we can be helpful to folks, even if they don't invest in the fund or the platform. We just want to be thought leaders in this space.
Yeah. I think thought leadership is a great wedge into this market. Maybe I'll go one layer above that. How do you think about just the public perception, right? These could be LPs, these could be other groups, but what do you think about that external brand, right? The thought leadership going to your LPs and prospects is great, but is there more you can do? I think about some of the folks who use, content engines, video, kind of really being out there, so to speak. How do you think about that in today's context, whether it be from the Whistler perspective or overall?
Yeah, no, I think in terms of being more active in the community, however big or small, we have been looking to build out more of a investment community within Greater Nashville. So actually, we just are thinking about participating in a investment organization or community specifically catered towards Greater Nashville and sort of
Uh-huh.
this area. GPs and LPs are really partnering together. It is a small town. I think folks really like visiting Nashville first and foremost. But secondly, I think there is just, clearly a concentration of healthcare players in
Sure.
this town. And so I think from here, outwards, I think that branding matters, right? Because I think we've covered this before when we last spoke. I'm having to spend most of my LP intro calls really emphasizing that Nashville is the healthcare services capital of America. Most folks don't know that, right? I think
Yeah.
everyone thinks Chicago, Boston, San Diego, but Nashville, by virtue of HCA, has always been a services capital.
Yes. Well, I think it is kind of knowing your audience too, right? If I were to tell you, hey, you should do some TikTok videos, does that'll attract potential new investors or things like that? Probably not the right path, right? I think you have to determine what's relevant and what's most important for you, and then magnifying that brand in those places, I think is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly to your point, because beyond LPs, we're obviously looking to build better ties and better dialogue with founders, right? And many of those founders are living in Nashville or Southeast US. And so knowing your audience absolutely matters.
Yeah. That actually raises an interesting follow-up. Like when you're communicating the brand as we're talking about it, do you have to tailor the message to those different audiences? I always think about the word authenticity and consistency and things like that. But if you're talking to LPs versus founders versus, other firms that could be co-investors, does that message have to change at all?
I would say the core message stays the same, right? I think across the board, the tenets of our DNA and investment ethos will always be the same, but we will absolutely emphasize different parts, different parties, right? Obviously, the dialogue with a co-investor is going to be different from the dialogue with a founder, right? But I think from all of these conversations, they should take with them the same basic principles and sort of who Whistler is or what a Whistler deal is, right?
Yeah. I think that too does resonate from my seat as an LP, right? If I look at how you talk to founders about what you're doing and it leans into certain areas, I think a lot of it goes back maybe to something you talked about before is understanding the project management capacity at a placement agent of like really building the story. And that story has to resonate. Yes, you emphasize different things, but it has to resonate broadly rather than I'm hearing from a co-investor or a founder that you're pitching them on a completely different story. That's the last thing you want, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think the last thing I wanted to touch on before we get into our bonus round is the idea of technology, right? I'd be curious to see, what tools or maybe even approaches do you think are most underutilized as GPs build and maintain relationships today?
Absolutely. I think for me, it's still about back to basics. I think there's still, I mean, forget AI, right? I think AI is obviously a buzzword that everyone's clinging on to. I think there's just so many aspects of what we do as day-to-day IR professionals that just still aren't in tip-top shape.
Hmm.
Anything from CRMs, I think obviously most firms have a CRM. Would they tout their CRM and would they be proud of it? Probably not. More often than not, everyone's like, oh, we use X, Y, and Z. They're fine, right? Ultimately, we still download all the names and work in Excel, right? I think for me, before we even push too much deeper into the realm of tech everything, I think a lot of these 101s, we could still benefit from honing them further and improving them further, right? So CRM for me is a top priority. Codifying a lot of the positive impact that we're doing across our portfolio is another one,
Sure.
right? So ESG has always been important. I think by virtue of being a healthcare services fund, there's a lot of good things that we're doing, right? For patients, for physicians, et cetera. That's something that, sure, you can use AI to pull together, but ultimately those KPIs you're deciding for yourself, right? So a lot of these fundamental criteria and sort of KPIs, you're still distilling yourself. So I think for me, it's still back to basics. I think in terms of changing the fundraising landscape generally, I mean, I really do have to laud what you and Job are doing, right? Which is to say, to date, there really hasn't been a uniform sort of industry-wide benchmarking kind of platform or any sort of platform that sort of highlights, hey, this is fundraising and this is how we can all do better together, right? Building that community. And so, I mean, there's certainly conferences where there are IR sort of fundraising conferences, but those are one day a year, right? And most of the time it's not really working level people, right? It's not going to be the analysts to VPs or directors. And so I honestly think that it's just very helpful comparing notes, sharing best practices and ideas. I think these go a long way because as I'm sure we both agree, IR and capital formation, it's a different iteration at every firm. Right.
Absolutely.
Every I can say, if I'm a PE firm, oh, we have headcount for an investment team VP. That's straightforward. And that'll probably be uniformed wherever you go.
Mhm.
But if you're looking for an IR team VP, I don't know what that means. What does that mean? You're going to have to give me at least 5 more bullets if I can even give you any semblance of a short list of candidates. Right. And so I think just the fact that it's so disparate, I think it's the fact that it's so different means that we can all benefit from communicating more with one another and right, building that community and forum.
I love that, Henry. And I think that you've put a lot of these nuggets in here. They sound simple and practical, right? I think a lot of people over engineer this process. I think in particular on the technology side, you can buy new tools, you can implement new, formats, new, data rooms and portals and CRMs, AI, as you mentioned. If you don't have the fundamental understanding of how this job gets done, none of that's really going to change your effectiveness. Maybe you can be more efficient with some of these tools, but I think at its core, I think you said it, every firm is different and you have to understand what's going to be the highest and best use for you and then tailor your approach around that.
Absolutely. And just adding to what you've just highlighted, Matt, is that baseline sort of need, but also the buy-in. Right? You need the buy-in from either your boss or your managing partner or your co-founders. They also need to recognize that that's important, right? Which again differs from firm to firm.
Definitely. Well, Henry, we will jump right into the bonus round now, which we do with all of our guests on the Raising the Brand series. So the one I love is what's one finance buzzword that you'd like to retire?
One that I find interesting is tabling something for discussion.
Really?
And I say this just because I remember I used to work for a British firm, and I think the Americans obviously thought tabled just means shelving it. Whereas I think the Brits thought, oh no, if we table something, we put it on the table for discussion. So I thought that was funny. There's a myriad of kind of finance buzzwords, but that one comes to mind first.
Yes. Well, the interpretations across the pond and globally, I think we could probably do a whole series on those. And Henry will wrap up with what's one piece of advice you wish you'd received earlier in your career?
Ooh, I would say find a mentor. Find a mentor or a sponsor, someone who's senior in this career field that hopefully you're pursuing, and go to them for guidance, right? I don't think enough folks, when they're, let's say, in college in their 20s, reach out to the broader kind of professional community and say, hey, listen, I'm in IR, don't know much about it, would love to grab a coffee and get your insights. And then beyond that, obviously developing these coffee chats into friendships and then mentorships, right? Or mentorships and then friendships. I think that's critically important, especially as you become more senior. It's always helpful to have that perspective and the person that's really serving as a sounding board for you as you navigate your career. I think that's so important.
It's a great piece of advice, and I think it's a great point to end on, right? You can always learn, you can always hopefully build community and relationships. It's core to the role and the industry. So Henry, I will thank you again for spending time and sharing some of these great insights. We really appreciate you being on the Raising the Brand series.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt. Really enjoyed our conversation.